In April of 1944, a sense of tension and expectation hung in the air. One general, more than any other, was under intense scrutiny by the German military intelligence. That man was General George S. Patton, who was believed to be the most formidable of all the Allied commanders. The Germans were certain he would lead the primary invasion of France, the D-Day landing. They feared his aggressive tactics more than any other, especially after his stunning successes in North Africa and Sicily. But little did they know that only 6 weeks before D-Day, the United States was on the verge of sending Patton home in disgrace. It all stemmed from a speech he made at a tea party in a small town in England. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, had an official relief order sitting on his desk. With a single signature, America's most feared general could be removed from his command, eliminating a critical military leader just when his presence was needed most. Congress was pushing for his removal. The press was relentless in its attacks, and the State Department was terrified that his controversial remarks could undermine the delicate balance of the Allied forces. At a time when the Germans were preparing to face the invasion, Patton's actions threatened to unravel the very fabric of the strategic alliance that held the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union together. It all started on the 25th of April, in the small town of Knutsford, England, where a local organization called the Welcome Club invited Patton to speak at their opening ceremony. The purpose of the event was to celebrate the presence of American soldiers stationed in the area. It seemed like an innocuous morale-boosting event, a casual gathering meant to foster goodwill. However, Patton's staff had warned him to tread carefully. He had just survived the slapping scandal in North Africa, and his public image was in tatters. One wrong word at this gathering could mean the end of his career. Despite the warnings, Patton seemed unfazed. He dismissed the concerns, deeming the event to be a private affair. He was told it would be a small gathering, no more than 50 people, with a few women's organizations and local civic leaders in attendance. He was assured there would be no press coverage. However, that turned out to be a misunderstanding, or perhaps a deliberate lie. Journalists were present in the crowd, unbeknownst to Patton. Standing before the modest assembly, Patton began speaking about the friendship between Britain and America, touching on the common bond between the two nations and their shared wartime goals. However, as he continued, he said the words that would nearly destroy his career. Patton, in his trademark blunt fashion, expressed that it was the natural destiny of the British, Americans, and Russians to rule the world. His words were bold and unapologetic, but he made a critical mistake. He left out the mention of Russia in his speech. According to some reports, he had intended to mention the Soviets, but whether by accident or design, those words were either omitted or not recorded. What followed was a catastrophe of perception. The news that Patton had declared that only Britain and America would rule the post-war world spread like wildfire. The press seized on the omission of Russia and portrayed Patton as a man who viewed the Soviet Union as irrelevant in the future world order. The damage to the Allied unity was instantaneous. The Soviets, who were suffering immense casualties fighting Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front, were crucial to the war effort. Patton's words, whether taken out of context or not, threatened to fracture the delicate alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union. And in the world of wartime diplomacy, perception was often more dangerous than reality. The story of Patton's speech spread across the Atlantic, and it was splashed across front pages in American newspapers. Patton says US and Britain will rule the world. No mention of Russia. That was the headline that the American public was faced with. The reaction from Congress was swift and brutal. Senators who had previously supported Patton after the slapping incident now turned on him. The political backlash was immediate. Calls for his dismissal rang through the halls of Washington. There were demands for an investigation and an inquiry into his actions. The American public had grown tired of Patton's controversies, and they were now ready to see him removed from command. Meanwhile, the State Department was in a state of panic. Diplomats feared that the Soviets would see Patton's remarks as evidence of a secret Anglo-American alliance meant to exclude Moscow from the post-war order. The stakes were incredibly high. At a time when the Allies were preparing to launch the invasion of France, Patton's words threatened to derail the entire war effort. Eisenhower, who had already been dealing with countless pressures, was furious. He had been working tirelessly on planning the Normandy invasion, and now he had to deal with yet another Patton scandal. His patience was running thin. In private, Eisenhower expressed his frustration to his chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith. His anger was palpable as he spoke about how tired he was of Patton's inability to control his mouth. He had defended Patton countless times, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. Eisenhower told Smith that he was seriously considering sending Patton home. He drafted a cable to General George Marshall in Washington, telling him that Patton was becoming more of a liability than an asset. Eisenhower was prepared to relieve Patton of his command and send him back to the United States. It was a harsh decision, one that would shake the entire Allied command. Marshall's response to Eisenhower's cable was calm but decisive. He acknowledged the political realities and the fact that Patton had become a political liability. But Marshall also understood that Patton's tactical brilliance on the battlefield was unparalleled. He was the best military commander the United States had. Marshall reminded Eisenhower that the decision to remove Patton would have significant consequences for the war effort. The Germans feared Patton. His reputation alone kept the Germans guessing. Sending him home would undermine the deception strategy, which was already in place to confuse the German high command about the location of the invasion. Marshall told Eisenhower that the decision was ultimately his to make, but he also made it clear that he would support whichever decision Eisenhower chose. The weight of the decision hung heavy on Eisenhower's shoulders. He had to choose between his best general and the political pressures mounting in Washington. Eisenhower knew that Patton's actions could not be ignored, but he also understood that the general's value on the battlefield was unparalleled. As Eisenhower wrestled with the decision, the German high command was closely monitoring Patton's movements. They had been tracking his every move since he arrived in England earlier that year. General Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox, had studied Patton's tactics in detail. Rommel admired Patton's aggressive, mobile warfare strategies and considered him the most dangerous Allied commander. The Germans believed that Patton would lead the invasion at Padal, the shortest crossing point to France. The deception that Eisenhower had created was built around Patton's presence in England. The FUSAG, 1st United States Army Group, which Patton commanded, was a phantom army designed to convince the Germans that the main invasion would land at Calais. As long as Patton remained in England, the Germans believed that the real invasion had not yet begun. But if Eisenhower were to send Patton home, the Germans might see through the deception. The Normandy invasion could be exposed, and the Germans would be ready for it. The success of the invasion could hinge on keeping Patton in England. While Washington debated Patton's fate, Patton himself knew he was in serious trouble. His aides brought him the newspapers from the States, and the coverage was scathing. Columnists who had once praised him now called for his removal. Patton was isolated and facing the very real possibility of being sent home in disgrace. It was then that he did something almost unheard of. He wrote a letter to Eisenhower, a letter that would come to define the most vulnerable moment of his career. In it, Patton expressed his regret for the speech and insisted that he had included the Russians in his remarks. He blamed the press for distorting his words. He wrote that he had been assured the event was off the record, and he pleaded for a chance to redeem himself in the field before being sent home. Patton's letter was a stark contrast to the image of the brash, confident general known for his ivory-handled revolvers and bombastic speeches. In this letter, he appeared vulnerable, stripped of his usual bravado. He had no choice but to appeal to Eisenhower's sense of fairness. He begged for one final opportunity to prove himself in battle. Eisenhower read the letter with mixed feelings. The political pressure was still immense, but Patton's plea struck a chord with him. It softened his anger, but only just. The decision still hung in the balance. Eisenhower asked his staff to assess the situation. Could the invasion succeed without Patton? The answers were sobering. Losing Patton would mean abandoning the deception that had kept the Germans at Calais. It would also mean losing a general who could lead from the front with unmatched aggression. No one else could match Patton's instincts for mobile warfare. Bradley and Hodges were capable generals, but they lacked the aggressive drive that made Patton so feared. Eisenhower knew the stakes were high. If he sent Patton home, the invasion could be compromised. On the 6th of June, 1944, the invasion of Normandy began. Patton was not there. He remained in England, overseeing his Phantom Army and keeping the Germans guessing. The deception worked. The Germans kept their best divisions stationed at Calais, waiting for Patton's non-existent invasion. As Patton sat in his headquarters, the sounds of the invasion reached his ears, but he was not allowed to join the battle. The most famous general of the Allied forces was forced to watch the fight from the sidelines. He listened to reports and read cables, but he was powerless to act. It was perhaps the hardest moment of his career. However, Patton's time in the shadows was short-lived. On the 6th of July, he received orders to cross the Channel. Third Army would go operational on the 1st of August. What followed was a campaign that would go down in history as one of the most remarkable in military history. Patton's tanks advanced with incredible speed, covering 400 miles in less than a month. His forces liberated towns and encircled German divisions. The same newspapers that had demanded his removal now hailed him as a hero. Eisenhower, who had once questioned his judgment, now watched with satisfaction as Patton's relentless aggression turned the tide of the war. In the aftermath of the Normandy breakout and the subsequent battles, Patton's legend grew. He had proven that he was more than just a military leader. He was a force of nature. But what if Eisenhower had signed the relief order in April of 1944? Would the invasion have been as successful? Would Patton's aggressive tactics have made the same impact? The risks of removing Patton were immense, and Eisenhower had made the right call in keeping him. In the end, Patton's survival of the Knutsford incident became a footnote in the greatest campaign of the war. His redemption was complete, and history would remember him not for his mistakes, but for his decisive actions on the battlefield. When historians rank the greatest generals of World War II, Patton's name stands at the top, not because he was careful, not because he was diplomatic, but because, when it mattered most, he delivered. The battle for France had reached its boiling point by June 6, 1944. The world waited with bated breath as the Allied invasion of Normandy began. Yet, despite the thousands of men storming the beaches and the explosive chaos of battle, General George S. Patton remained an invisible figure. He was still in England, managing his Phantom Army with precision and ensuring that the German forces remained convinced that Calais was the real invasion point. Patton, a man known for his bravado and unrelenting nature, was forced to stay in the shadows during one of the most significant military operations in history. It was a moment of bitter irony for Patton. The man who had carved his reputation on aggressive tactics, swift maneuvers, and boldness was reduced to being a ghost. listening to static reports from a distant battlefield. The soldiers in France were fighting and dying on the beaches, and Patton, despite his desire to lead them, was forbidden to join the fight. He was forced to stay in his headquarters, isolated from the action, unable to contribute in the way he was born to do. But in this moment of restraint, Patton understood something critical. The success of the D-Day invasion depended on his absence as much as it would depend on his future participation. While Patton was absent from the beaches, German High Command remained firmly convinced that the main invasion would land at Calais, just as the Fusagi deception had intended. The Germans had deployed their best forces to Calais, leaving the actual invasion force at Normandy relatively unopposed. Patton's presence, even as a mere phantom in the eyes of the Germans, played a critical role in keeping their attention fixed elsewhere. Without Patton's reputation and the deception created around him, the Normandy invasion could have faced far greater resistance, and the Allied forces might have suffered far higher casualties. For weeks, Patton remained in England, anxiously waiting for his chance to rejoin the war. His impatience grew with each passing day. As he watched the calendar, the days dragged on, each one bringing him closer to the moment when he would be able to resume his true purpose, leading his forces on the battlefield. Yet, each passing day also brought him closer to the uncertainty of his future. He had narrowly avoided being sent home in disgrace. His reputation was in tatters, but he had survived, and now he had one final chance to prove his worth. During this time, Patton did not sit idle. He obsessively reviewed the plans for Third Army's operations in France, studying the maps and meticulously planning his next moves. His staff drilled tactics into their minds, prepared for the moment when they would finally be called to action. Patton knew that when he was finally given the green light, he would need to move swiftly and decisively. Time was of the essence, and the war could not afford delays. The success of the invasion and the liberation of France depended on the speed and audacity that Patton had made his trademark. Finally, on July 6, 1944, the orders came through. Patton was to cross the English Channel. Third Army would become operational on August 1, 1944, and Patton would be at the helm. His time in the shadows was over. The general who had once been the most feared figure in the German High Command was about to make his return to the battlefield. Patton was ready to reclaim his place in history. The Cobra operation, the breakout from Normandy, began in earnest, and with it, Patton's Third Army surged forward with relentless aggression. Within a month, his tanks had covered an astounding 400 miles. They liberated town after town, encircled German divisions, and captured thousands of prisoners. Patton's aggressive tactics, which had once been the subject of so much controversy, now became the cornerstone of the Allied advance. His tanks tore through the German lines, pushing back the Wehrmacht with the kind of audacity that had made Patton famous. The American press, which had once been ready to tear Patton down, now hailed him as a hero. Time magazine featured him on its cover, celebrating his return to form and the overwhelming success of his campaign. The generals who had once doubted him, the politicians who had demanded his removal, now praised his brilliance. Even Eisenhower, who had considered sending him home only months before, watched with satisfaction as Patton's Third Army achieved what seemed impossible. But even as Patton's Third Army pushed deeper into France, German commanders were already bracing for the next challenge, the Battle of the Bulge. Patton was the man who could move swiftly, maneuvering through difficult terrain, and leading his forces in the kind of high-speed operations that could turn the tide of battle. While the other generals hesitated, Patton was already making plans. Eisenhower, who had been deeply concerned about Patton's ability to control his mouth, now found himself relieved that he had kept Patton in command. His decision to let Patton stay had paid off, not only in the Normandy breakout, but also in the critical moments that would come later in the Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge was a test of everything Patton stood for. The Germans had launched a massive counteroffensive, and the Allied forces were on the defensive. It was a desperate situation, but Patton was ready. He had already prepared contingency plans, and within 48 hours, his forces were on the move. The Third Army covered a vast distance in record time, arriving just in time to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne. The Germans had thought they could break the Allied line, but Patton's Third Army smashed through their defenses with the same aggressive tactics that had made Patton a legend. Once again, Patton's brilliance on the battlefield had saved the day. When the Battle of the Bulge came to an end, Patton's Third Army had proven its worth once again. The general, who had nearly been sent home in disgrace, had now become the heartbeat of the Allied advance. His tanks had liberated town after town, freed thousands of prisoners, and helped push the Germans back. It was clear now that Patton's reputation as a commander was solidified. No longer was he the controversial figure who had been nearly removed from command. He was a hero, a living legend whose contributions to the Allied war effort were undeniable. Looking back at the events of April 1944, one can only wonder what would have happened if Eisenhower had signed the relief order. Would the Fusag deception have held? Would the Normandy invasion have been successful without Patton? The answers are unclear, but what is certain is that Patton was a man of unmatched tactical brilliance. The decision to keep him in command was, in the end, the right one. Had Patton been removed, the course of the war might have changed. The D-Day landings might have faced greater resistance, the Normandy breakout might have taken weeks longer, and the Battle of the Bulge might have ended in disaster. Eisenhower's decision to keep Patton in the game was a gamble, but it paid off. The general who had been on the brink of disgrace became the man who helped turn the tide of the war in Europe. The speech at Knutsford was a close call for Patton. It was the moment that nearly cost him everything. The moment when a single word could have ended his career. But instead of being his downfall, it became a footnote in the story of a general whose actions on the battlefield would secure his place in history. Patton's redemption was not just in his survival, but in the sheer brilliance of his tactics and his ability to deliver when it mattered most. As historians look back on the events of World War II, Patton's name remains at the forefront of military strategy. He was a man of controversy and brilliance, a man who was willing to take risks, push boundaries, and fight for victory. Patton did not play by the rules, but in the end, it was his unique approach to warfare that made him one of the most successful generals in history.